Now, the order of service tonight is yet to be made known to us. So we will begin with Nehemiah there in chapter 6. We're going to do 6 verses. And then we'll probably have a couple of songs of worship. And then we'll step into a time of communion. We do have Bibles in the back. I'll read you the verses, but it would be nice for you to read them there yourself. But when we look back at the close in Nehemiah 6, what we saw was the wall was completed. Now, of course, we got the side note that the gates had not been hung, and that's okay because they'll be hung tonight. They will be hung tonight, and what we learned from Nehemiah is that as the news of this success, I would imagine the roars of celebration as it went forth through the city of Jerusalem. Again, what we know from Christ, his depiction of Jerusalem is it sat on the hill and it was a bright light. He says in Matthew chapter 5 that in many ways the church is like Jerusalem. We're not meant as a light to be set under a basket, but we're meant to be set on top of a hill to shine. A picture there of Jerusalem on Mount Zion, the temple there. But the enemy got word of it. And if you guys recall, they were disheartened and they were dismayed, but not done. It would become sort of a stumbling for them, and yet they would mount up a new siege mount against them to keep them from doing what God had commanded them to do. And that would then step us into Nehemiah chapter 7. And again, we're going to look at 6 verses. And then we're going to continue our worship. And this is what Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 6 says. Then it was. Now, what I love about, again, the process of penning the Scriptures. Now, we know that there is inspiration given by the Holy Spirit to a vessel that's been ordained for the task. And that inspiration is manifested through revelation, then which comes to us, which we read later, as illumination. There, now you've had your Doctrine 101. But then it happened. And I think, again, of the actual scenario as Nehemiah and Ezra, this has now been completed and some time has passed. And they were encouraged by the Spirit to chronicle everything for historicity's sake. For those Jews who would come after, because what we know is that the temple would again be destroyed, and so would Jerusalem. This would take place in 70 AD after Christ's ascension, and the church was birthed. In fact, what's interesting about eschatology is we know that the Jews are still waiting for their Messiah. And the earmarks of this Messiah, the Scripture says, he will be a man like Moses, and he will be the one to orchestrate the rebuilding of the temple. So the temple that we saw rebuilt in Haggai and there in Ezra, and now we're seeing the wall being built, well, it would be destroyed. But Nehemiah would record it for those generations that would come. Again, an encouragement. We learn in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that these things were written for our edification. What I love about God is he did not conceal the stumbling of Israel. We are not Israel, we are the church. But he would record their life for our sake, that we might learn. Now, Paul would say as the grafted branch, the wild branch that's been grafted into this tree, we should not gloat in that. Because as easy as he removed the natural branch, he could also remove us if he chooses. Again, the sovereignty of God. But it says, then it happened when the wall was built and I hung the doors. And then after this, what he's going to begin to do is sort of share with this, what I am seeing as this commencement ceremony and these appointments that take place. But what it says there is the wall was built. Again, this momentous accomplishment by God's people. It is finished. Now, a term that Chuck would use is, oh, glorious. And I love that. Because you could imagine, again, something that was in ruin for 100 years, one spirit-filled man in a small church with a desire to serve. Amen. Would build it in 52 days. Again, something that terms like momentous and one of a kind and glorious don't really capture what God had done. And yet here we know it is finished. Although I would arguably say some of the more profound words in all of the Scriptures, because isn't that what Jesus said on the cross? It is finished. And so was the wall. And then he said, I hung the doors, or the word there is installed. But what's important for us as students is the doors symbolized fortification. You see, what this was a statement not only to the enemy, but the surrounding nations and even the inhabitants of Jerusalem that we are secure. The walls built and our gates are up. Interesting, because when I think about my door at home, we got 3 bolts. And I lock all 3 of them. And after I'm like, we're secure. So I can empathize with that sense. But it was an accomplishment. And again, it would be a resounding testimony to those enemies we're going to learn are probably at bay and lurking in the darkness. But it would also speak to the surrounding nations. Our God is a great God. And then sort of this commencement, I'm guessing, for me it's like this ceremony takes place, because what Nehemiah does is he begins to list the appointments that he would do as the governor. He says, and when the gatekeepers, now the interesting thing about gatekeepers, the term there in the King James, might be porter. Ultimately, the term there is security guard. Again, these would be men that would be stationed at all the entrances of the city. And what's interesting is, just like in our times, it's sort of a dubious employment, isn't it? The mall security guard, someone we belittle as having no authority and no strength, and what can he really do? Well, that was sort of the same esteem for these men too. We learn there in Psalms 84 verse 10 that David would suggest it as a lowly position, though he would still rather be a doorkeeper than resting or dwelling in the tents of the wicked. But these guys were looked down upon. And yet in many ways I want to expose that opinion and estimate with this. We discover in John chapter 10 verse 3 that Jesus would say, I am the doorkeeper. Our Christ took that lowly position of guarding the city, although for him it would be the pen, the sheep gate, where all the gates would be, where all the sheep would be corralled. The sheepfold, I'm sorry, is the term. And Jesus would say, well, I am the door. I am the gatekeeper. Again, for us now, it sort of sheds some new light on just how valuable this position is. And then he also says the singers, and we're going to get into the singers next week. Again, what I love about Israel is their, and it's not prominence, but they esteemed singing and dancing in their forms of worship. David both danced in his servant's garment, if you recall, when the Ark of the Covenant was returned. And he was the one who was always getting together the choir so they might sing praises to their God. And here he says, you know what? We got the security guards. We got these, military men that are going to guard the cities. And by the way, singers, come here too. I don't know. The Lord has a sense of humor. And then he says the Levites. They had also been appointed. And what's so interesting about this station is that this tells us that bloodshed, that kofar, the sacrifice, was now being restored. Offerings were going up to the Lord. Doors hung, gates secure, men in place, they're singing, and blood is being shed. So you can imagine the jubilation that was taking place. And then look at verse 2. All of a sudden we're going to see his brother Hananiah brought back into the scene. He says, and that I gave the charge of Jerusalem. So here it is this appointment, this governor's appointment, but he's delegated the military and civil matter to, it says there, to my brother Hananiah. Now we know this gentleman, the actual blood brother of Nehemiah, from chapter 1 verse 2. Again, he would have been the courier who came into Jerusalem with the news of the desolation that the city had gone through. Now the name Hananiah means gracious gift of God, or Hanani. And then Hananiah is also mentioned there as the leader of the citadel. He too would have now been stewarded and delegated some responsibility. Now his name means Jehovah is gracious. So they both sort of have that fragrance of grace. Yeah. Now something I had learned while I was studying a couple weeks ago, that grace can be a type of acronym. G-R-A-C-E. Now don't stumble, you realize I can spell. But grace could also mean God's riches at Christ's expense.
Wow.
Yeah. That's why, exactly, that's like my sister right there. Right? That was my response too. I was like, wow, that's a keeper. God's riches at Christ's expense. Now, of course, we are the recipients of grace. So we get all of his riches. Again, we know Jesus, who was rich, became poor. Why? So that we might become the richness of God. God's riches at Christ's expense. But what we know about this gentleman is he was a city official. Again, the term probably more appropriate for his capacity was captain. He was the captain of the citadel. But the term citadel speaks of this, a tower of defense. Now, this tower of defense or citadel would have been seen by the residents as sort of that last stand. Once the citadel is torn down, the military strength has been breached, and men can come in. But look what it says. Look what Nehemiah says. Check this out. This is Nehemiah's opinion of his own brother. Now, I laugh because I have a brother too, and it's like, it's not until we became adults that we actually have a favorable opinion of one another, right? That's the way siblings are. But look what he says about his brother. And he says, for he was, now again, this is the basis to Nehemiah's appointment. He was a faithful man. That term faithful speaks of stability. He had a trustworthy character. Again, he would have been upstanding and would have had this honest reputation. The term we use is integrity. This was a man of integrity. We also know that he feared God more than many. Again, so he had this reverential service towards God. Again, what we can glean from that description by Nehemiah was this was a man of deep spiritual convictions, a man of integrity, and a man who loved the Lord. In fact, Nehemiah would say there that Hananiah was actually something special or different because he would use sort of this comparative language to say many loved God more than others. But what I love about this is both men like Nehemiah, we discover, were deeply patriotic. These were loyal men to their nation. Again, when I look at Nehemiah's practice, these must have been essential and important qualities in a leader according to Nehemiah. So if we want to appoint someone to a position, to look over our affairs, we want him to have integrity, and we want him to be a man of God. And that's it. Remember going through Acts chapter 6, it's like you look at the list to qualify for the job, and it's rather simplistic. Though we don't always adhere to it, which is sort of where the heartburn comes, because it's very basic. And yet when we look at it, it's so simple, and yet it seems like very little qualify. Yeah. But we got to stick to it. So this man had integrity, and he loved the Lord. And then look what it says in verse 3. And these are going to be the governor's instructions. And he said, and I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. Again, here what we're getting ready to see from this expression is that the hours of operation of the city, that the door would not open until the sun had fully risen. Again, ultimately, wait till the sun was well into the sky. The reason Nehemiah would demand this is because when the sun was up, it was easier to expose the hidden enemies who may have been lurking in the shadows. Again, here, by waiting till the sun was up and having the gates closed, the city was ready to defend itself if necessary. Now, when I was thinking about this too, and learning some of sort of the commerce of Jerusalem, this thought came to my mind too. In many ways, Nehemiah was also keeping the visitors and the merchants outside until it was time to open up. If you recall, the merchants of Israel had this blasphemous practice of operating on the Sabbath. Right. You remember that? That was Jesus' heartburn. It's like, it's Sabbath, it's God time, and you guys are here making merchandise of Him? And that was their practice. They had this practice of foregoing the Sabbath. In fact, that's why we're going to learn tonight they went into Babylonian captivity. And here we sort of, I get this picture that these guys are ready to go to market, and Nehemiah's like, man, it's not time. You just stay outside until the city is ready. Again, visitors and merchants were probably lined up outside. And then he continues his thought, and he says, and while they stand guard, so these men are on duty, it says, let them shut and bar the doors. So here he's telling us that when hours of operation are done and it's evening time, that when the city is closing, so must the gates. Again, they need to be closed overnight and secure. We know that to be so in a practice of them because of what Joshua says in Joshua 2:5. You guys remember the story of the harlot Rahab in Jericho? Remember when the two spies came in and she hid him somewhere on top of the rooftop under some bales of hay? Perhaps it was up there. In fact, we learned in Acts chapter 10 that part of what took place on the rooftop was the drying of vegetables and the drying of different things. So it would have made sense for her to have bales of hay up there. But we remember that the spies were then hidden by Rahab, but when the men of the of Jerusalem would come in, they would say, "Where have you seen him?" And she says, "Well, they snuck out of the city before the gates closed." So we know here this is a practice that they would esteem. You got to keep the doors closed at night. But then he goes on and he says, "And appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem." So essentially Nehemiah is saying, oh, and these guards who are responsible for the city's security, they must be residents. Again, what we discover here is that employment qualifications, they must first be residents. Well, why is that so important? Well, we know from John chapter 10, verse 12, that there are also hirelings. And anytime these hirelings see the sign of danger or the wolf, the hireling leaves the sheep and he flees. I see citizens being a lot like shepherds in that they have a lot at stake. They have a call of duty, a loyal patriotism, and they have a genuine love and therefore a sense of responsibility, and they will serve and protect. So the minute you raise up in the ministry, they better be going to that church. It better be the place that they're tithing, and it better be the place that their babies are being taught. We don't want to bring someone out from the inside, again, following a practice that Nehemiah had found wisdom in. Again, if you hire men who live within the city, most likely their wife and their kiddos are just down the road. They're going to guard the city with all their lives. Again, what it does for us is it gives us wisdom in regards to whom we would raise up within the ministry. You know, do they have sort of a stake in the things that are done here? Or are they just passing through? And then he says this, and he says, "And one at his watch station," which was probably what you would call a regular post at this assigned duty, "and another one in front of his house." Now what I love about this is a similar tactic we saw in the wall building. Again, that battle array. If you guys recall that when they were building the wall, in one hand they'd have a sword and they'd have a trowel in the other. Remember, they'd be laying brick and with the sword in case an enemy came. But it worked then, so Nehemiah is implementing it now. Again, if we see something working with the Lord, why change it? I know right now you might not be able to tell from my disposition, but I'm naturally restless. And I'm constantly like, man, I need to do something, Lord. Like I jog in place during my time of meditation. And I was really praying, and though God is using me just about every day of the week, I'm very restless, and so I was seeking Him for counsel. And going through a Bible study, I was listening to Acts, believe it or not, and looking at Barnabas, and something that earmarks his disposition is this: he was always steady course. And the Lord said, man, stay the course. Just stay the course. And if you have extra time, use it to seek me. But stay the course. Again, here we learn from Nehemiah that this was something he had found previously to be successful. So why change it now? Why change it now? Cause these men to be responsible for their own homes first and in the city also. I love that. Again, much more for us to learn. And then verses 4 through 6, and then we'll have a time of worship. It says there, notice here what Nehemiah's description of the city. It says, now the city was large and spacious. Well, what does that mean? Well, it just means it was large and spacious. Mm-hmm. Trust me, I tore it apart, and it means large and spacious. And I was like, man, that's kind of a bummer. I got no notes for that portion of my paper. But look what it says next. It says, but the people in it were few. Again, there was this scarce population, and most likely a result of the Babylonian captivity? Well, no, technically not. There was a scarce population because of the judgment of God. Remember, it was about 2.5 million people that went into captivity there in Babylon with King Nebuchadnezzar, and only a remnant made it out. About 70,000 had come back. About 65,000 had been stewarded through through King Cyrus. And the prophet there had to come back and to rebuild the wall. Because God had executed judgments on those who were unfaithful to Him. But God would always leave a remnant, and you guys know that the function of a remnant is to testify. And that's what we see here. They were physically scattered, and they were not centralized. They were separate, and they were unorganized. But this is who God had left as a testimony to those around them. It's a few. It's a few. And then he says, and their houses were not built. Now what I love about this is these were the real conditions and the stated odds that these people were going against. According to the circumstances, as we see with our eyes, us men with our logic. I think part of my restlessness is a product of being logical. It's like, I could. The Lord's like, but I never said. But I'm like, I could. But I didn't say. But anyways, back to Nehemiah. We see there the real conditions and the stated odds, but what we know about their lifestyles, essentially they were nomads or tent dwellers. Again, this would be a lifestyle that they were familiar to. We know from the Egyptian Exodus how they would wander as they would hunt for the promised land for 40 years. Now listen to this. This is one of my favorite verses regarding having that pilgrim mindset. It's in Psalms 84 verse 5. I thank God for these tabs. 84 verse 5. One of my favorite passages. In fact, it was a Bible verse God had given to my wife and I as we were making our inroad here. It says, "Blessed is the man whose strength is in you and whose heart is set on pilgrimage." Whose heart is set on pilgrimage. And I don't know how to exactly say this. There's still such a deep connection for me and Calvary Chapel Golden Springs. Yet this is my earthly home and this Jerusalem has become my love. And yet my heart is set on pilgrimage. I mean, I ain't here forever. I'm going to be raptured before you know it. I'm ready to go home. But in the interim, we're going to lay some inroads here. But my heart is set on pilgrimage. It's like, man, I'm just here but for a vapor and then I'm gone. Now, does that mean somewhere else? Zilly and I were talking about that here. And again, it's nothing that I would want. But like my friend said today to me during a text, I'll do whatever God asks me to do. And so I would echo that sentiment. Me too. You know, if he's like, man, you wrecked a shack on the shore of Peru. I want you to teach people to surf and the Bible. I'd go. Zilly would probably stay here. But anyways. Traveling pilgrims. But again, I say all of that because there is a mindset we need to have as we're passing through. We're passing through. We need to be cautious, deadly cautious on the attachments we give to this world. Paul would say we are in this world, but we are not of this world. And we need to live with that manner. And then verse 5, and this is probably going to be the main point for tonight, and verse 6, and then we'll worship. And then look what it says. Then my God. Now what I love about this is we see that God, Jehovah, was something that was claimed by Nehemiah. Nehemiah would seize and take with abandonment Christ as his. Again, there's something so essential in us receiving Christ. Again, it is the accepting of an invitation and the treasuring of the gift. Again, receiving Him is essential and it is non-negotiable. We're going to learn we're probably not going to have time, but in John chapter 3, what we discover is that a man must be born again. And as I was thinking about Nehemiah's declaration that God was his, God sort of before me began to paint this illustration. So bear with me as I stumble through it. And as I thought about his declaration, this question came to my mind. Can you really have a proper wedding, at least according to the world standard, without a reception? Can you have a wedding without a reception? Now you cheapskates are thinking, well, yeah. Right? I know you are. And Christ understood that too. Again, I need to concede that us cheapskates are like, yeah, we can have a wedding without a wedding reception. But Christ says, no, you can't. He says, you know what? There is a remedy to that attitude. Again, Christ would put the reception first before the wedding. In other words, you cannot have a wedding or be married to Christ if you have not received Him first. There has to be a reception before the wedding. Again, the question for us tonight is, have you received Jesus Christ by faith? No reception, no wedding. And no wedding, it means no marriage supper of the Lamb. Luke chapter, and when it comes to that reception, Luke would say in Luke 15:10 that the angels rejoice when one sinner repents. But they cannot get to the wedding ceremony if they first have not been to the reception. In fact, we find that principle throughout the Scriptures. And Nehemiah understood that. He had received God into his heart. In fact, listen to what it says. And then my God put it into my heart to gather the nobles, the rulers, and the people, that they might be registered by genealogy. So what Nehemiah says here is that God had put in his heart. Again, this idea was by God, planted in Nemo's inner man. It was this inspiration to assemble. Here he was given God the recognized and the credited source. But what we know too about this is Nehemiah had to be a yield vehicle. Again, our participation is cooperation. As God would put things into our inner heart. And he says, gather the nobles and the rulers, these would be the city officials, and the people, the citizens, again, the constituents, that they might be registered by genealogy. Again, he wants to put together, God wants to put together the city registry, or sort of what I would call a census. Again, it was God's idea to chronicle the generations. This would become now a legal and historical document or a matter of record for us. We're going to get into it next week. And then Nehemiah says, and I found a register of genealogy of those who had come in the first return, and I found it written. Again, what we see here is there was an existing previously scribed record and of the returning Jews from the exile to the homeland, and Nehemiah would use it as a reference and a model. Again, the practical wisdom of Nehemiah. In fact, I wrote here, Nehemiah's practical wisdom was genius. It was already done, so he would use it as a model. Again, there are so many principles for leadership for us to glean from. We're part of a network, not a network, that's someone else's term. We are an affiliate of a movement. We are a movement of God. And my pastor, Chuck Smith, God has used him to establish a framework that if we want to, we can build upon. And before I built upon it, though, I will tell you, I scrutinized it. Made sure this is something of the Lord. Through discernment, through the testing of spirits. And now having it been proven to me, guess what? We build using that frame, that same blueprint. Just like Nehemiah. He saw something that was done before, possibly by David, and he said, you know what, it works, and we're going to follow it, just like us following Pastor Rawl and following Pastor Chuck. And then lastly, verse 6, it says this. And these are the people of the province who came back from captivity. Again, what's cool about this is we discover that the very same subjects of the census are the same area that Nehemiah wants to record as well. And he says, of those who had been carried away, and again we know this from being the Babylonian captivity, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away, and who returned to Jerusalem and to Judah, everyone to his city. Again, these are going to be the model that we're going to use next week as we look from verses 7 through, I didn't even bring it because I'm like, I got to make sure I don't get to it tonight, from 7 and on. And we're not going to read the names. I normally read the names and I break down the meaning to you. This time we're just going to read through and we're going to try to glean some principles. But for us tonight, looking at Nehemiah, there's much that we can apply. Now here's what I want to do. I want to pray. And give you some homework, and then we're going to have a time of communion. How many here know the story of Nicodemus? John chapter 3. Go home tonight and read it. Because what you'll discover there is Christ does say that a man must receive him. The term there doctrinally is regeneration. You'll get to know it, right? But it means to be born again. And that's essential to sort of what we're kind of learning from tonight. But here's what I want to do. Read ahead, Nehemiah chapter 7, read John chapter 3. Would you pray with me? We're going to have a time of worship. We'll pass out the blood and the juice. I'm sorry, the body and the juice, the cracker and the juice, the body and the blood, the cracker and the juice. Let's pray. Father, you're all those things. You're everything.